You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to USIP. My name is Mary Glantz. I am the senior advisor in the Center for Russia and Europe here at the Institute. It's my honor to once again welcome Gregory Feifer, the executive director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. This is one in a series of events we've had with his institute that's been absolutely fantastic and has really given us a light into the Russian exile community and Russia itself. Today, we're pleased that he has brought with him the returning ICWA fellow, Aron Ouzilevski, who will deliver his fellowship report here on his 2 years reporting on Russian exiles who were fleeing authoritarianism, militarism, mobilization, and a deteriorating economy at home, before and after the Kremlin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Aron will be joined by two other leading Russians in exile, Lyubov Sobol and Anna Veduta. So please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much for that terrific welcome, Mary, and thanks to everybody at the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting us in this lovely space once again. And it's so good to see you all here in person and everybody joining us online for this important discussion. Because almost 3 years into the Kremlin's war against Ukraine, there's been no end, and there are so far none on the horizon, no end in sight to Russia's existential threat to that country, its independent sovereign neighbor, or its attack on global liberal democracy. With President Putin now hard at work building a coalition with North Korea, China, Iran, and other authoritarian states. And with Putin's neo-Stalinist administration at home inexorably dismantling open society inside Russia through violence, punishment, and fear, many hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled, as you all know, joining emigre communities in cities around the world. Just like during the Cold War, when waves of emigres settled abroad following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, this burgeoning society in exile includes leaders of the political opposition, of civil society, media, private enterprise, academia, and many other sectors, and it faces major challenges, not only obtaining visas and employment and housing, but also because of suspicion in their host countries and among themselves, amid a pernicious Kremlin campaign to undermine, threaten, and punish Kremlin critics abroad. Aron Ouzilevski has just finished 2 years as a fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs, or ICWA as we call it, based in one emigre hub, Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, of course, but also traveling very widely to other centers across the Caucasus, the Baltics, Central Europe, Central Asia, and beyond, observing on the ground how political leaders, activists, journalists, civil society, artists, tech professionals, and many others left Russia and are adapting to new lives and new careers, and how they're affecting their host countries and what they reflect about Putin's Russia back in their home country. He's also been asking exiles about what they think about Russia's future and what will come after Putinism. His fellowship was generously funded by the U.S. Russia Foundation, for which we are very grateful. Aron will talk about some of his overarching findings and conclusions and then join our stellar panel today. Just a couple of words about our panelists. Before his fellowship, Aron worked as a freelance journalist and cybersecurity analyst, and his work has appeared in The Guardian, in The Economist, and the Moscow Times. And we're just incredibly lucky to have with us also Lyubov Sobol in the middle, who is a leading Russian opposition politician, an ally of the late Alexei Navalny, who conducted journalistic investigations in Russia while serving as a lawyer for Navalny's anti-corruption foundation. She currently leads anti-propaganda projects on YouTube, attracting hundreds of thousands of viewers. And last year, she was a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, SIPA. And Anna Veduta, on the end, is Chief Outreach Officer of the Free Russia Foundation, doing lots of work with and for exiles around the world. Anna was Alexei Navalny's first press secretary, and she also served as a global outreach director for the leading Russian media platform Medusa, and later she was vice president of Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, spearheading advocacy efforts here in Washington. So Aron will talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion. We'll broaden the topic, and we'll finish with a Q&A with the audience here in person, and take questions over Zoom if we have time. And with that, I welcome Aron.
Thank you, Greg, for the robust introduction. Thank you, USIP, for hosting us. And thank you to the audience who came here on this hot November day. On a spring evening in Tbilisi, Georgia, 1 year into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a young designer from St. Petersburg in her late 20s sat slumped on a curb outside of a Russian-owned pop-up shop, where a birthday was being celebrated. Clutching a bottle of wine, she screamed at the world in her native Russian. "This system," she began, referring to Vladimir Putin's Russia, "and this mother effing Putin, they gaslit us. They gaslit us on all fronts. We were told we defeated fascism, and now, mother effer, we're resurrecting fascism." She rambled into a story about her grandmother, who survived the Second World War, only to die of COVID-19 complications after catching it from paramedics. A victim, she said, of the same system and its neglect. Her rant, punctuated with expletives, drew hushed comments from her friends, who urged her to quiet down. In Tbilisi, a city with a strong anti-Russian sentiment, lingering from Russia's 2008 invasion of Georgia, and reignited by Russia's war in Ukraine, loud, angry Russian could easily invite reprimands. In some venues, Russian passport holders weren't even allowed. But she didn't care. "I want everyone in the city to hear me," she shouted. Her outburst, to me, captured the essence of Russia's current wave of emigration. She fit the profile of the majority demographic leaving the country: urban, middle class, educated, with access to social capital, wearing trendy clothing, between 25 and 40 years old, and from a major Russian city. Her tone, which felt both performative and painfully real, was laced with confusion and disorientation, as if the political reality of the regime she grew up under had hit her like a train on February 24th, 2022, the day the full-scale invasion began. For people like her, life in Putin's Russia had been comfortable. The chaos and poverty of the 1990s, brought upon by Russia's swift embrace of capitalism, was long gone. Despite geopolitical tensions, there were still connections with Western institutions in the arts, tech, science, and academia. Innovation was thriving, and the budgets of oligarchs, ballooned with the help of corruption and oil money, had transformed Moscow and St. Petersburg into incredibly modern cities, sometimes even more comfortable, according to the complaints of recent Russian emigres in Germany, than European capitals like Berlin. Yet, in the years leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin had waged a war with Georgia, illegally annexed Crimea, started a hybrid war in eastern Ukraine, poisoned, murdered, and imprisoned political opponents, staged show trials, and attacked civil society organizations. Still, for many, financial stability and career growth took precedence over politics. For most Russians, politics was either passé or taboo, too mundane to care about or too intimidating to confront. How do you stand up to a state with such a sophisticated security apparatus? Instead, why not launch a podcast about how Russians in the first generation of newfound wealth can spend their money effectively? Even many of Russia's most politicized people, from independent journalists to open political dissidents, tacitly signed off an unofficial social contract with the Kremlin. With each year, they would continue to adapt to new restrictions the government would introduce, and hope that eventually the modernization of Russia's cities would in turn pull the Russian government into the 21st century. In a recent interview, the renowned exiled film critic Anton Dolin reflected on why Russia's liberal class tolerated Vladimir Putin's regime for so long. "We thought we were just living under a party of crooks and thieves," he said. His comment, referencing Alexei Navalny's expression for the United Russia ruling party, suggested that Russia's liberal class had overlooked the deeper forces of imperialism, nationalism, and militarism lying deep beneath Putin's rule. Still, for many, the war and the intense repression that followed became a red line. Yet it was also a shock, catching people off guard, with many fleeing the country before fully processing what had just happened to them. This ambiguity is central to understanding this wave of Russian emigration. Many immigrants struggle to even define themselves. For example, the term exile or izgnanny feels too permanent or implies that they were forced out for political reasons. When Putin announced the partial mobilization in September 2022 to bolster the front lines, many Russian men fled not because of any specific political targeting, but out of fear of military conscription. Many of the emigres I spoke with are also in limbo, with one foot still in Russia, one foot out. Many continue to return temporarily for work projects or family visits. Many work remotely on the Russian market. Even the number of emigres remains contested. Some researchers estimate that 1 million Russians have left since the start of the invasion, while others indicate that this number is decreasing as many individuals are returning. The term émigré also feels off to many. It implies integration into a new country, a process many in waypoint countries like Georgia don't envision. This ambiguity also reflects the nature of Putin's regime itself, its policies and ideology. Consider the pro-war Latin Z symbol. Originally a military marking, it gained traction online among pro-war groups, and the government adopted it as a unifying emblem. Its origins have no ideological basis. Meanwhile, the Kremlin still refuses to call the invasion a war, opting for the euphemism special military operation, to downplay the conflict's scope. Most Russians feel the war is distant, the fighting rarely reaches them directly, and many soldiers are contractors, seeking a payout, not patriotic glory. One exile I spoke with, an avant-garde theater director who fled Russia after police raided his home due to his anti-war performances staged in Moscow's metros, described the regime's ideology as boring fascism, highlighting its vacuous nature. This pervasive ambiguity shapes the psychology of many émigrés. Just as the Kremlin, a hybrid, quasi-fascist regime, wages a war that it does not call a war, this migration is itself a hybrid phenomenon. While most I spoke to are resolved in their decision to leave, often citing their inability to accept the new militaristic reality, some have expressed doubt about their departure. Take a Siberian lawyer who defended victims of human rights abuses, including journalists and Navalny campaign members. Initially fearing for his safety, he left Russia, but the choice strained his family. His wife and children remained behind. A new suitor has entered the picture. Towards the end of our conversation, he pondered if he should have stayed, kept his head down, and shifted to a different practice, noting how much more money professionals are making in Russia now. Another respondent, a 31-year-old composer, recently told me he felt gaslit by Russia's opposition, who convinced him that if he didn't leave by March 2022, he'd lose his chance forever, as rumors swirled that Russia would close its borders imminently. His experience in Tbilisi was difficult. His Georgian relatives, and he's a part Georgian, stole $10,000 in cash from him while offering him shelter, and he faced hostility due to his Russian background, which compounded his trauma. Yet he directed his anger at Russian liberals, blaming them for his decision to leave, a decision he now seems to regret. This was a man, mind you, who cried the day Alexei Navalny died. Now, I want to discuss the recent waves of migration from Russia, which actually began in 2021, the year leading up to the invasion. This was the year when the Kremlin began ramping up its repressive measures, labeling Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation as extremist and drastically expanding its roster of undesirable organizations. This crackdown prompted the evacuation of hundreds of activists, initially to Georgia and later to the Baltic countries and Poland under humanitarian visas. Since my co-panelists were likely involved in some of these processes, I'm happy to explore this later on the panel discussion. The second major wave began in March 2022, following Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. In response to new draconian wartime censorship laws, rumors of imminent martial law, and the threat of potential border closures, approximately 500,000 Russians, journalists, tech workers, creatives, academics, entrepreneurs, and activists from its major cities left the country in the months that followed. Operating on little more than hearsay, many fled in panic during the first weeks of the war, scrambling to secure flights to former Soviet countries with visa-free travel as ticket prices soared. Some of my own friends from St. Petersburg ended up in Osh, Kyrgyzstan's second largest city, simply because it was the cheapest available flight. One friend even got a tattoo of the city's name, a token of gratitude for the warm welcome he received from the local community. Then, in September 2022, the announcement of partial mobilization sparked yet another wave of emigration. Around 400,000 more Russians, primarily men, fled, fearing conscription into the military and the escalating war. Once again, desperation took over. Thousands of Russians fled by car to any neighboring country with visa-free access, including Mongolia and Kazakhstan. Since those waves of immigration, Russians who may have lacked the resources to leave initially continue to depart. The migration is ongoing. This summer, in Serbia, I met two LGBTQ+ exiles who had only left Russia a few months prior after the government labeled the LGBTQ+ movement as extremist. One, an activist, stayed behind after the start of the invasion to help the most vulnerable until her work became too dangerous, while the other, a 31-year-old trans artist and bartender, left when his parents finally saved enough money for his departure. This August, I had a particularly poignant conversation with a couple in their 50s who were visiting their son in Tbilisi from Russia. At first, I hesitated to mention my research, assuming they might prefer to avoid politics altogether. But when they asked about the best places to emigrate, I was surprised to realize that they were asking for themselves. The father, a music teacher in St. Petersburg, described how patriotic songs had been added to the curriculum at his music schools, and a portrait of Putin had appeared in the elevator. The atmosphere in Russia, they said, had become unbearable. This Russian emigre wave is primarily comprised of high-skilled workers from Russia's major cities. Many retained remote jobs for the Russian market, while others have created new jobs to service their compatriots abroad. Their adaptability and resourcefulness have allowed them to quickly rebuild their lives in exile. The sheer speed with which they established new mutual support networks and infrastructures in just weeks following the invasion is extraordinary. Telegram chats swiftly became bustling hubs for everything from housing and job opportunities to cultural events and even niche services like dog sitting. Simultaneously, new volunteer-driven civil society organizations emerged, offering aid to Ukrainians fleeing war, setting up shelters and offering psychological help for fellow Russians fleeing repression, and even facilitating the evacuation of Russian conscripts seeking to dodge the draft. Beloved Russian musicians who stood up against the war are now touring cities like Tbilisi, Yerevan, Belgrade, Almaty, Vilnius, and Berlin instead of performing across Russia. In countries where barriers to entry are lower, many Russians have opened new businesses or transplanted familiar ones: coffee shops, bars, sleek bookstores, galleries, and yoga studios studios, private Russian schools that reflect the cultural tastes of their previous lives. Places like Tbilisi, Yerevan, and Belgrade have become hotbeds for these new ventures, infused with the energy of emigres from Russia's more developed economy. In many ways, this migration represents a profound shift, one of the few times in history that people have fled from the imperial center to settle in countries that were former colonies. In the present day, these shifts almost resemble a form of gentrification. What also sets this wave of migration apart is its distinctly 21st century character. The rise of digital nomadism and remote work, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, has provided emigres with a unique flexibility, allowing them to continue their careers while living abroad. This adaptability has made this migration far more fluid and dynamic than the migrations of previous generations. I feel it's important to also note that this wave of emigration is not confined only to those with social capital. Among my respondents were state university professors from Russia's Volgograd region who, despite their low salaries, chose to leave because they could no longer tolerate the propaganda infiltrating their schools or the passivity of their colleagues. There was also a middle-aged archaeological assistant turned house cleaner who fled after calling his pro-war colleagues at Moscow's Archaeology Institute deranged and now cleans homes for more affluent and younger Russians in Tbilisi. Ethnic minorities from Russia's republics also joined the exodus, including a Buryat Buddhist monk who felt that his religion was being manipulated by federal secret services to shape public opinion in Russia's Far East. Now, in each place that Russians arrive, there's always a particular context. In Georgia, anti-Russian sentiments run deep, largely fueled by the 2008 war and the country's strong identification with Ukraine, as well as its aspirations for European integration. In Tbilisi, Russian and Georgian communities live in parallel societies. Georgians boycott Russian-owned establishments, while Georgian civil society seldom reaches out to Russian activists. By contrast, Armenians have taken a very different approach. Facing their own aggressors in Azerbaijan and Turkey, Armenians tend to view Russians more neutrally. During last year's crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, which led to Armenia's loss of territories, Russian exiles were among the first to respond, providing housing and creating digital infrastructure that collected food, clothing, and other supplies for Armenian refugees. As Armenian author Narian Akbaryan put it, "It was a show of humanity and unity that felt very natural, and we Armenians were warmed by these gestures, which reminded us that we were not alone." Meanwhile, in Serbia, a country shaped by its historical losses in the Yugoslav wars and its resentment towards NATO and the West, a pro-Russian sentiment endures. In new Russian-owned bars, you'll often find Serbian men raising a glass to their Slavic brothers, much to the embarrassment of the proprietors. In the face of today's global uncertainty, it's difficult to predict the future for this group. Everything is in flux. Those who left Russia in March 2022, hoping to return within a year after a Ukrainian victory that might trigger a regime change back home, now face a different reality. The war has entered its third year, and Ukraine's prospects for total victory seem to grow dimmer, particularly with recent shifts in U.S. politics. There's a scenario in which a Trump administration could end the war, potentially prompting a significant return of economic migrants. Still, a large number, based on my own sample size, around 70%, and this is excluding activists and journalists facing criminal charges back home, remain resolute in their decision to stay abroad. Some jokingly describe their emigration status with the acronym PPZH, PPZ, Пока Putin жив, which translates to While Putin Remains Alive, a play on the bureaucratic acronym VNZH, Вид на жительство, which translates to residency permit. Ultimately, their fates will depend on broader global events. Take the specific example of Georgia, where tens of thousands of Russians still reside. The recent Georgian election remains contested, with the ruling party accused of pro-Russian sympathies and even suspected of Kremlin influence, claiming victory. Most Russians in Georgia deeply oppose this party, which has cracked down on civil society and the LGBTQ+ movement, trends the Russians themselves fled from. However, Georgia's liberal opposition, leaning heavily on an anti-Russian sentiment, has pledged to impose visa restrictions on Russians, which would potentially compromise the status of anti-war Russians in Georgia. Once again, these exiles are caught between two fires, trapped in a state of flux and ambiguity. In a place like Georgia, my project also raised ethical questions. Georgians and Ukrainians might wonder why a focus on people from the aggressor's country, those they see as privileged, still sipping on lattes in exile while Ukrainians flee destruction. I felt this tension acutely in my first month of the fellowship, living with a Ukrainian roommate. After yet another missile barrage on Ukraine, I watched her cry, fearing for her grandmother's safety. In those moments, it was difficult to sit down and transcribe interviews with Russians. But when asked why these people deserve a voice, I answer that their stories reveal how an authoritarian regime can deceive and pacify a generation of critically minded individuals by masking its hostility. Through their backstories, which I've explored carefully in my writing, we can better understand the mechanisms that enabled Putin's regime to endure. Thank you.
Aron, thank you so much. I don't know if is my microphone on? Yeah, good. Glad you can hear me. That was terrific, Aron. Thanks. And I've got follow-up questions for you, but I would like to jump first into discussion with our other panelists. And Lyubov, I'd like to start with you, if I may, because you are an icon of the opposition movement for having bravely helped lead protests in Russia, risking arrest and violence and worse. But I want to ask you about your experiences after you left Russia, your experiences in emigration, and not only yours, but the general challenges for emigres as you see the biggest ones, including getting visas and work permits and bank accounts. And also some of the differences between the various waves of immigration about which Aron spoke a little bit about. Can you talk about what happened after you left Russia?
Thank you. Should I use microphone?
No, you're good.
No, I'm good. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here. Yes, my name is Lyubov Sobol. I'm from Russia, and I was forced to leave my country in 2021. And I like a joke for Western audience, like maybe for the first time in your life you are looking at a real terrorist, because indeed I'm in Russia. I'm on list of terrorists and extremists, and I'm called as a foreign agent. And 5 criminal cases were opened against me in Russia. The last one was opened because I'm running my YouTube channel, and I described for Russian audience about massacre in Bucha, Ukrainian Bucha, and it's like it's prohibited in Russia by criminal law. I accused like I'm spreading fakes about Russian army. So yes, and I was forced to leave my country 3 years ago, and I think that my experience is unique. It's irrelevant for other immigrants, because my name is well known in the Western world, but so I didn't have any difficulties with visa issues, with bank accounts. It was easier to get them before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So I didn't have any problems with that, but I know that a lot of Russians who are now in exile, they struggle. It's difficult for them to obtain a visa and work permit and travel permit and to open bank accounts. And it's not about just yoga classes, but it's about basic conditions for living. Because if you don't have just basic conditions, you can't be a volunteer, for example, because you should thinking about your children, about your wife or husband. You should think about your life, how to get apartment, because you don't have any credit scores, you don't have bank accounts, you cannot get apartments for rent. Yes. there are a lot of difficulties. And when I was forced to leave Russia, I came to Estonia, and now I'm living here in the US, and it's a different experience, because I think that in diasporas, Russian diasporas here, and for example in Estonia, they're very different. For example, in Estonia, I think that there are a lot of Russian people who went there during Soviet Union time, and I think that percentage of pro-Putin people in Estonia, Russian speakers people in Estonia, the percentage is even higher than in Russia, because they have not been to Russia for 30 years. They don't have anything about real life in Russia now, about modern life. They know about Putin's policy only through the state Russian propaganda, like Simonyan, Solovyov, and other bad guys on Russian state TV. So, if people living in Russia, they know about real life. They just look for the window. They know the prices in grocery stores. They know how difficult to live in Russia if you have. If you want to obtain some freedom for speech, just political freedom, any kinds of rights, and even religion rights and others. So, and yeah, in Estonia, there is a huge Russian diaspora, and it's very deeply pro-Putin. And there is a difference between people who left Russia, like in 70s or 90s, like 30 or 50 years ago, and between people who left Russia 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 1 year ago. Because people who left Russia like 2 years ago, they are opposition, they are from opposition, they are against Putin, and there is a difference between Russian old generation people who are living abroad, Russian speakers, and younger generation. In Russia, there is no difference because, for example, I was a chief of one of YouTube channel, Navalny Live. It was the most famous media of Navalny on YouTube, and we have a half our audience, which was 35 years and older. So in Russia, we are supported by different people from different generations and different, I don't know. But if we are talking about diasporas and people who are in exile, there is a big difference between people who left Russia like 30 years ago and who left Russia 1 or 5 years ago. And for example, in California, there are a lot of people who are working for big tech companies like Twitter, like Google, and they are young people, and they are against Putin. Most of them, the majority, are against Putin, and I know a lot of volunteers who are working, for example, during daylight, like for Google, and in the evenings they are like a volunteer for human rights projects for a Russian audience. Yes, so I could. What should we discuss?
Well, we
can stop now.
Sure. Well, we can return. I'd like to also jump to Anna, because you were also a fixture in Russia as Navalny's spokesperson when he emerged as Putin's leading challenger, and you established yourself abroad earlier than the latest waves of immigration as well. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experiences as well, and also a little bit about what you're doing now for the Free Russia Foundation.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for having me here. And yeah, as you mentioned, my experience is very different from what we've just discussed. I actually didn't have an intention to immigrate first. I came here in 2014 to get my master's degree from Columbia University. And then after 2 years, I just moved here in Washington and started working for Medusa. And then one thing led to another, and by 2019, or 20, I realized I can't go back home for the reason that my former colleagues from Anti-Corruption Foundation, they've been accused and prosecuted for the same tweets I had on my Twitter account. So I just realized if I go back, I risk being arrested, and I really didn't want to. So that's why I stayed here. For me, it's been easier to integrate because I realized that, and I can only imagine talking to my friends, talking to other, Russians who recently got exiled, that sometimes for them it's just like, you pack your suitcase and you go nowhere. You don't have anything on your mind. You just need to move on. It wasn't the same for me because I had, a prospect of education. I had something to occupy myself with, and I to keep my mind around something while I figure out what I do with my life further. So I consider myself extremely lucky for that matter. And because not only because I consider myself lucky, but because it's important, to help others, especially when you've been given so much by the destiny, by the life. And that's why I decided that I will continue the path of trying to help our poor country and its dissidents from here, from abroad. And as Greg mentioned, yes, I've represented Anti-Corruption Foundation for a while because I received a letter from prison in the early 2022, before this full-scale invasion. It was in January, where Alexei Navalny wrote to me, "I heard you were going to a private sector," and guilty as charged I was. And he said, "Private sector sucks. You should go back, work for us." And I said, well, what can I do? How can I say no to that person? Of course I can't. So that's how I found myself back with Anti-Corruption Foundation. I've been representing them here in Washington until the murder of Alexei Navalny. And I always stress that I know that it's common to say that he died in prison, but rest assured he was murdered. He didn't die for natural causes or anything like that. He's been murdered for his position and for who he was. Now, Free Russia Foundation is an organization with quite a wide profile of projects, and we not only help Russians in exile, we also help Belarusians, and we do projects with Ukraine for the POWs and civilian hostages. But when we're talking about the integration of Russians abroad and this newest wave we were discussing, we've created something. So the umbrella term for that is called Reform Help. Reform spaces are basically the co-working spaces in different cities. We have one in Vilnius, in Warsaw, we have one in Budva, in Paris, the one in Madrid. We used to have one in Tbilisi, but we had to move it to Madrid because it became less and less secure for Russians to be in Georgia. And these reform spaces are basically the centers where people can come and work. For example, in their projects, they will be provided with Wi-Fi. They will be, provided with coffee, tea, anything. Just a space to work. Just a space where you can come and find like-minded people. And it's not only that, of course. It's not only spaces. The Reform Help covers the the psychological help. We have courses, we have, it's a blended format. Sometimes it's groups with psychiatrists, sometimes it's, you can join it by Zoom, sometimes it's just the lectures. But basically, a lot of people who come to reform spaces, they come with burnout. They are absolutely psychologically destroyed. And it's absolutely understandable that in no way we can compare what Russian exiles are coming through with what is Ukrainian communities coming through. We cannot compare these things. And of course, all our sympathy goes to Ukrainians and to brave defenders of Ukraine. But yes, this newest wave of immigration also needs help and also needs new senses to live, basically, because it is what it is. It's gonna get complicated. The world is chaotic. it's not gonna get easier. We can, tell by now that it's only gonna get more complicated. And we simply need each other. We simply need to lend a helping hand to those who need it more right now. And as of, of the last, let's say like half a year, we've received a lot of inquiries for help from LGBTQ community, because as you know, these people have been declared, basically the same terrorists and extremists as this wonderful lady over here, just for being who they are. That's it. So not even for, as they say, spreading the LGBTQ propaganda. No, just for being who they are. And we at Free Russia Foundation help to, of course, for these people to leave Russia and to, find some safety in Europe. We help with the documents, we help with the, applications, with all the paperwork. But again, imagine being exiled just for the fact that you were born this way. And it's not even for your political views, which is also very important. So that's what we're focusing on in this reform help and reform space. We try to, to provide psychological help. We try to provide some, we have accelerators. We give like small grants to people who want to do something, to do new projects, to also help others. We try to unite this community because we believe that if we unite the exiles and the Russian diaspora abroad, they can be the force that helps to, if they are visible, if they are heard, if they feel like that their anti-war position and their belief in a better future for everyone is heard and seen, they can influence Russians inside, and Russians inside who have the same views as them but are too afraid now. So they basically can become voice for the voiceless, although they also need help to gain this voice, and that's what we're trying to do for them. I think I'm gonna stop here, but I'm happy to. Another thing which I wanted to tell you about that. So in the reform spaces, we of course have different lectures from people who come to present their projects, or I don't know, shows their documentaries or anything. But the most important thing, which I think is done in these spaces, is so-called political prisoners' evenings. So people gather to write letters to political prisoners, and that is extremely important. And that is the thing that you cannot underestimate how important it is, because, for example, we just had Ilya Yashin recently here in Washington, who've been exchanged. I work very closely with Vladimir Karamurza, who also was exchanged and who spent like the 2.5 years in a solitary confinement in a Siberian prison, where he was absolutely sure, in his own words, he was going to die in. And first-hand testimony of these people. These letters to political prisoners are just the ray of light and the hope and the lifeline for these political prisoners. So we try to do it regularly. And for example, Evgenia Karamurza comes to this when she travels Europe, and she comes to these reform spaces and she leads these evenings. So we try to do that because anything we can do basically, because it is so important to help each other in moments like this. And once again, the world is becoming way and more chaotic place, and it's going to get worse. So we're just bracing ourselves and trying to be by each other.
Thank you very much, Anna. Aron, I'm going to come to you in a second because you've spoken to other opposition leaders, but you've also spoken to a lot of different Russian exiles in a lot of different places. So I want to ask you about that. But I'd like to return to you, Lyubov, if I may, and just ask, a question that comes up when I speak to Americans the most about sort of what they're interested in and what's going on with the political opposition. Can you sort of describe, in general terms, what has happened since the death of Alexei Navalny earlier this year? And perhaps the biggest question is, why doesn't the Russian opposition unite?
Thank you for the question. It's a difficult one, but I'll try to be honest. I think that the Russian opposition is pretty united because, for example, then the full-scale invasion to Ukraine started. There was no question like support Ukraine or support Russia, Russian government. There was no question like who started this war between Russian opposition. There was no question like should we occupy Ukraine? Maybe yes. Then it was like every leaders in Russian opposition, every activist told at the very first time day that we should stop this war. We should try to stop this war. We are against this war. We are against Putin's policy. We are against Putin's war in Ukraine. So it's pretty united. Like we are promoting democratic values between Russian audience, among Russian audience. We are promoting Western path of life. We are promoting institutions like independent courts, independent medias, and other stuff. So in this sense, we are united. But of course, we have some disputes, we have some discussions, we have some debates among Russian opposition, and I think that it's okay, because only in dictatorship you don't have any disputes at all. If you are living in democratic society, it's okay to be. Sometimes you agree, sometimes you disagree with somebody. So I think that it's okay. And we are trying to do a lot of things among Russian opposition. For example, me, myself, I'm running my own YouTube channel. Right now, I was the head of Navalny's YouTube channel, but now I'm running my own YouTube channel, and I have millions of views between Russian audience. A lot of people from independent journalists in exile, they are running their projects, and I think that only who else is providing news and realistic opinions on what is going on in Russia for Russian audience? It's only people who are living in exile right now, independent journalists, politicians like me, and who are talking with Russian audience about mobilizations, about the war in Ukraine, about corruption, and other about criminal activities of Russian government right now. It's people who are living in exile right now, and we have human rights projects, anti-war projects. I know that there are a lot of projects from Russian opposition which try to help Ukrainian refugees in Georgia, in other countries. So we are trying to do our best.
Thank you for that. And Aron, back to you about the feelings of, for lack of a better word, ordinary exiles. Where are they looking for their leadership? How do they feel about the opposition, and is there some kind of common sort of unified sense, or is it really sort of fragmented like the emigre communities?
Okay. I want to reference Lyubov's earlier conversation about the waves, the different waves of immigration first, before I get to your point, Greg. You were talking about emigres who left in the 90s and earlier to Estonia, and their kind of support of Vladimir Putin. And this actually was really pronounced, and the sort of dissonance between this new wave of anti-Putin migrants and the old emigration. And this was really pronounced during the last Russian elections, if we can call them that, when emigres stood in lines in Berlin, in Latvia, in Estonia. Those who had just arrived were filling in spoiler ballots. They would fill in Alexei Navalny, who had just passed, or they would vote for an opposition candidate, hoping that maybe a systemic opposition candidate, hoping that it would maybe cause some change. But there were also many people who had lived in Germany, in Estonia for many years, and all of a sudden there were arguments happening in the line. And it was so strange to sort of observe how these two groups from different generations coming from the same country have completely polar opposite views on the situation. There was a complete kind of dissonance between the two. So in response to your question about what does the broader emigration wave think about the current Russian opposition, unfortunately, I'm going to offer a more sobering analysis. So I think Alexei Navalny's death was very pivotal. But even before Navalny had passed away, many Russians weren't quite sure where to turn. The Russian opposition is quite online, and the infighting, though, as Lyubov said, it might be a good indicator of a healthy kind of democratic debate. Still, it often spilled into sort of petty argumentation, and at a certain point, I think many Russian emigres just stopped paying attention. Then Alexei Navalny died, and this was a huge tragedy for everyone, because his endurance in prison was still kind of felt like a symbol that one day, you know, if the Putin regime collapses, we have him sitting there waiting for us to come take the mantle and lead us into the future. Shortly after his death, people were in shock. People were crying. People were completely disoriented. But they were really emboldened by Alexei Navalny's widow, Yulia Navalny's comments to the European Union when she stood up on the global stage and said, "We will avenge Vladimir, my husband's death. We will continue to fight." Since then, I think people have slipped back into this kind of disconnect with the Russian opposition, because again, you know, what has been left of Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, they are now conducting investigations about, you know, which other opposition member attacked one of their, Leonid Volkov, one of the members of their team. So the infighting has kind of reached a sort of unimaginable level, and it's tough for a lot of people, and I think people are just kind of hoping that things will change on their own. But I think what Anna was saying about the sort of civil society organizations in emigration, the people who help, and there's been a major emphasis on saving lives, and I think this has been the most kind of impressive feat by many Russian civil society organizations in exile, the sort of smaller activists who, again, open these shelters, who help people with, there's this organization called Vavazhuk, which helps people who have criminal cases opened against them flee the country. There's Iditi Lesem, which helps people, men who were conscripted, flee the country. So it's about saving lives and preserving these people who oppose the regime, helping them get settled, helping them get psychological aid, in the hopes that at least there's something of a semblance of a sort of free society and emigration that can one day maybe return to Russia in some hopefully not too distant future.
Thanks, Aron. I want to ask both Lyubov and Anna about your public outreach and what are the biggest challenges in speaking to both Russians in exile abroad, but also Russians inside Russia, and also if you could say a few words about the media industry as well. Anna, you especially, having worked for Medusa, what are the biggest challenges, and what do you see as the main audience? Again, is it exiles? Is it people inside Russia? And in any way, how many Russians are being reached inside Russia, and in the climate of fear that exists now, how do you even measure public opinion, or what passes for public opinion? How should we be talking about support for Putin or opposition against Putin?
You want to go? Okay. Well, first of all, public opinion. Let's address this issue. Right now in Russia, you can go to prison for 8 years for calling special military operation a war for what it is. Take example of Sasha Skochilenko, the artist from St. Petersburg, who replaced price tags in the local grocery store with anti-war, quote. 8.5 years behind the bars. And so in that climate, I would urge you to, look at any kind of polling which comes from, government-owned institutions or even those who claim themselves to be independent. Because it is not, right now, the way to ask the question, are you against war, is actually, the answer to it, the right answer saying, of course I am against war, can actually lead you to arrest. Case in point, a person was arrested, I think, a couple of weeks ago, exactly for that, exactly for participating in poll. So I would say that people are not very enthusiastic to speak the truth to the pollsters, and thus we cannot actually rely on those numbers. That being said, there are some things that can, showcase us that the support for the war is not that, monogamous and huge as Putin's propaganda on the first hand, and, sometimes not only Putin's propaganda but media makes us believe. Because, for example, we don't see lines in the conscript centers, like, at all. Like, people are not wishing to. It is not a patriotic war for them. It is not a people war for them. Yes, Russian society is very, the majority of it is a silent majority. That is truth. We do not deny it. We cannot, close our eyes and say that, it's not what it is. It is what it is. They are silent. They try to, avoid mentioning it altogether, trying to go on with their lives as if it is not happening. But is it new in history? Is it, though? I mean, was it different in Germany? There was also the silent majority who, and what was an underground movement who were able and ready to risk their lives just to show their opposition to war. And it happens in Russia right now too. For example, Arseniy Turbin, a 16-year-old person, a schoolboy, is now in prison for spreading the anti-war leaflets. A schoolboy. That's where it comes. So I mean, I don't want to sound overly optimistic, but it seems to me that the regime which believes in its, huge and widespread support should not be arresting children. Just one doesn't go with another. So I would say that if there was an opportunity for people in Russia to actually say their opinion out loud, the majority would be against the war. And not even for the goodness of their hearts. Again, like, ordinary people are ordinary people everywhere. But because it's just not normal. But because it brings some difficulties for them too. Of course, if they were shown all the atrocities happening there, and if they were to believe that, because what Russian propaganda does, the Kremlin propaganda does, and I think it's the most dangerous thing about Kremlin propaganda, is that it convinces people. It's not trying to say that Russia is a wonderful country and Putin is a liberal leader. No, they say, it's as bad everywhere as it is here. And people started to believe it, because when you see that, every day around you, and you kind of get used to this, double thinking, not saying what you are actually thinking, and you start to believe that it's everywhere is like this. And that's the problem. So when you tell them that there was a Bucha massacre, they say no, it was staged, because for them it's like breathing, because everything is staged, everything is fake news, and I mean, we cannot say that it's only Russians who fall to narratives like that. I'm sorry. So I would say that don't give up on Russians. Don't try to lean on these numbers or some kind of narratives that we get here, that they're united in their support. I would conservatively say there are like 20% maximum of Russian society who are actually supporting war for I don't know for what reason. Something happened in their childhood or whatever. But I mean, something is wrong. But again, we do have around this percentage in every country of people who are, who we will not be considering like, people we would like to have over dinner at our house, right? We just have to deal with it. And then we have like 10, maybe 15% of people who are extremely brave and who are still inventing ways to protest, who are staying within Russia, and are still inventing ways to protest, to show their protest. They are, working for this underground resistance. They are still spreading these leaflets. Sometimes they get arrested. And then we have like the silent majority who would prefer for all of that not happening and who would prefer to be left alone with their lives and, to raise their children and do what, normal people do. So I would say that's what we are having. And then again, talking about the challenges to spread information there, we should keep in mind that first of all, big tech was not a good help with us like with actually countering the disinformation and Kremlin narratives. They did quite the opposite. They helped very much Putin's propaganda, and they continue to do so instead of helping. And no matter how many times we addressed them, no matter how many research papers we prepared for them, or I prepared a wonderful paper on that, and there were talks and there were discussions, nothing happens, so we're basically all alone on that again. And on the other hand, the Russian authorities are slowing down YouTube, which is like used by 90 million of people in Russia, conservatively. Again, I think the number might have updated since the last time I checked. They are slower in it, and it was like basically the window of truth for a lot of Russians. And they have to use VPN. And when they're using VPN, we can't count how many people are actually watching from abroad and watching from Russia, because again, we don't see this because they're using VPN. So yes, it's hard, but it's millions, it's tens of millions of people. As far as I know about the audience of TV Rain or Medusa. So, well, yeah, as I said, it's gonna be challenging. The resistance is gonna, suffer more, and these VPN tools that are developed currently by wonderful initiatives are also very much fought by Russian authorities, by the watchdog. So it's just very, very complicated, but we're doing our best. That's what I can say.
Thank you. And Lyubov, whom are you trying to reach?
I want to talk about challenges, and I want to be honest that Russian opposition needs money because, for example, let's talk about YouTube channels. Like in Russia, you can't get any news, any real situation about the war in Ukraine or about some cases from Russian authorities through the media which are now inside Russia, like all TV channels, all radio stations, all newspapers are under Putin's control. And so people, audience from Russia can get news only from through YouTube channels or Telegram channels. And for example, me, myself, I'm running my YouTube channel. And if you run YouTube channel, you need to hire a production team. You need to be you can't produce big TV shows. It's too expensive, but even you have some stories, you have your own blog, you need money to produce content. And when the full-scale invasion in Ukraine started, Google blocked monetization on YouTube. So if you produce your content for a Russian audience, which what I do now, you can't get any money from Google because they blocked any ads and monetization for in Russia. So you can't get money from Google. You can't get money from company and ads of company, because if you have a company in Russia and you have an office, you can't ask for advertisement on the channel like mine channel, because you will be in police station immediately. So you can get money from private companies. You can promote them because it's very dangerous for them. And so how you can pay salaries for your people, how they, your team can lease their apartment, can buy some food for their children. They need money. Another challenge is I talked about visas issues, like issues with bank accounts, opening bank accounts. There is a big problem for people to open them. For example, for me, I made a fundraising company 1 month ago on GoFundMe platform. It's a well-known platform for fundraising here in the US. I started this process and I was blocked because I'm from Russia. I sent them my US papers, I sent them my details about my bank accounts here, but still I'm blocked now on the GoFundMe, a platform for fundraising. You can't use platform for fundraising in Russia because Russian government could put pressure on the company. So you can use only platforms for fundraising which have offices abroad, like from Silicon Valley. But you are blocking. You will be blocked there because you are from Russia. So there are a lot of issues. And another angle, I want to talk a little bit about touristic visas. I think that sometimes I was told that we should block locked Russian people inside Russia and they will start the revolution. I think that it doesn't work like this because it's like a meat against meat grinder. So it's difficult to start a revolution right now. People in Russia are poor people. They don't have money. They don't have guns, and it's difficult to overthrow Putin's regime if you don't have anything. If you could be put in prison immediately if you start a protest in Russia right now. And I think that tourist visa, the Western world should not block touristic visa for Russian people because you are locking people and their money in Russia. You are blocking, and you should promote democratic values like letting people to see by their eyes what Europe is, what the US is. And for example, Navalny's team, we made polls every year for 10 years, and we asked Russian people, what do you think about Europe and what do you think about the US? And we saw the trend, when problems with visas for US started in Moscow, because of embassy conflict. Before that conflict, before 2013, people answered we are not against the US. US is not an enemy. And after problems with visas started, each year we saw that people started to answer the US is our enemy, we don't believe, and something like this. Because right now, for example, if you are living in Russia, you can obtain the visa for the US. You should go abroad, for Kazakhstan, to Poland, but it's difficult to get to Poland, because you can obtain the visa to enter Poland, but you should. Yeah, it's very difficult way to obtain U.S. visa right now. So the U.S. for Russian people, it's a different planet. It's very aggressive planet, but where everybody is talking about Russia and wants to Russia to collapse and something like this, because they don't understand they can't see by their eyes that ordinary Americans they do not care about Russia at all. They don't want to destroy Russia immediately, and other narratives of Russian state propaganda. And with Europe, it's better because before the war in 2022, Russian people could go abroad to see by their eyes that Europe and France and Germany, it's not the enemy. The people are very polite and welcoming for Russian people. And so there was a project by by Vesna. It's a project of young generation people from Russian opposition, and they ask Europe to let young generation of Russian enter Europe and provide visas for just, for example, 2 months with no conditions, to let young generation of Russians just to see by their eyes what Europe is. And right now it's difficult to get any visas, and it's difficult in you believe the state propaganda that they don't like Russian people because they don't let even enter their country to their country. So I think that it's a bad decision, and it should be changed.
Thank you so much, Lyubov. I have a million other questions, but we need to get to a Q&A with the audience, so let's jump into that. If you raise your hand, we have over here, and a microphone is coming to you. And please identify yourself and stick to one brief question, if you would.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to thank you. My name is Tomas Koren. I'm here with the Czech Embassy. Would like to thank you for all of your contributions. I had a lovely time. I would like to ask Mr. Ouzilevski, I would like to understand the mindset of people who think about going back to Russia. So if I'm a young person in Georgia, I am disappointed with my position and I'm thinking about going back to Russia, how likely am I to be persecuted for having left? How do I think about maybe being employed by the military? What are my prospects going back? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question. There's always this sense of anxiety. I know several people who have actually returned, even just for a month, just to kind of see their family, and in anticipation, they're really worried what's going to happen to them on the border, men specifically. They land in Sheremetyevo or Pulkovo airport, one of Moscow's major airports. They go through the line without a single question. And I think this is kind of the Kremlin's way of trying to signal to emigres who are, again, not political exiles who have criminal cases against them, but to the ordinary people, that everything is fine. You're free to come back if you'd like. A lot of people delete all their telegrams or have second telegram accounts in order, because there is the occasional border patrol officer who will just start scrolling to see if you posted anything about Ukraine. But in most cases, and there's thousands of people coming into these airports every single day, and everybody is going through without a problem. And so this sense of normality kind of psychologically affects people when they return. They realize everything seems fine. I mean, there's all these patriotic pro-war posters, but if I just don't look at them, I can continue, to shop at Azbuka Vkusa or whatever, these luxury grocery stores, and I can continue to make money. And what's also become a big issue is that because there's less competition in many different fields, in many different professional fields, there are more lucrative opportunities, and people are enticed by these opportunities. Unfortunately, and again, this is not political exiles. These are people who left on political convictions as well, but are maybe realizing that getting a humanitarian visa to Germany and having to live in a refugee camp is just not what I want to do. And the future of Georgia seems quite unstable. Maybe I'll just come back to Moscow. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Wait, a question in the very back.
Thank you very much. Matthew Murray from Columbia University, where we were honored to host Leonid Volkov last week for a similar type of discussion. He's up at New Haven for the semester. So the issue that arose from the work that Leonid's doing to poll Russians, not about their position on the war or not the war, but just on how they feel about day-to-day life has revealed a certain point of vulnerability, if you will, in Putin's administration of the country, and that is in the healthcare sector. And I'm just wondering if you've noticed something similar. In other words, typical Russians starting to complain more than they have in the past about the lack of health care, in part due to the fact that sanctions are working at a very basic level to prevent the importation of new equipment to do, sophisticated operations. So I guess the general question is, when you think about Russian public opinion, do you keep it in a separate category and look at how they're measuring their day-to-day lives? What trends are you seeing there? Thank you.
So I assume this question is for me, I guess?
Yes, it's for you.
Thank you. The most vulnerable, part of the society, of course, suffer the most. I mean, there are difficulties with obtaining, the viable, vital medications right now for people. But I think that, and maybe I am just not well informed on that, but we didn't notice any kind of general trends on that. Because, first of all, healthcare in Putin's Russia never was great. And I'm not quite sure that people do associate it necessarily with the Western sanctions right now. Maybe it's just like they've been told that, well, we have to, as Russian officials always say, like, you have to endure it. We're Russians, we're going to stay through that. Of course, they're going to stay through that in their palaces, and the ordinary Russians will basically starve in their very small houses where they don't have actually toilets inside. So I might be just not well informed, but I know that people are suffering from that, and we actually advocate against sanctions like this. So it's way more important to sanction the details for the weapons, which has still been important in Russia from some Western countries, which is really something that shouldn't be done during the third year of war. But at the same time, yes, prohibiting and making sanction the vital medications is not that something that should be done too. But again, it is what it is. But I can't say that we have indicated any kind of trends on that.
I want to jump into the discussion and say that, Russian state propaganda uses sanctions to say that you are so poor not because of our corruptions. You are so poor because of Western sanctions. So they use these narratives to say that it's a Western world, try to collapse our country, but we should be united, and that. But sanctions work, but not enough. And it's not enough to help Ukraine and to overthrow Putin's regime. So help for Ukraine is not enough. And if we are talking about money for Putin's war in Ukraine and for his security forces, he has a lot of money. He can continue his war. I think that the U.S. could significantly decrease oil prices. I don't know why Biden did not do it. I know that Trump said that he's going to do it, and I think that significantly, a collapse of oil prices could help.
Let's question here in the front, Peter. But I just want to ask, if I may, Ellie, because we're coming up to time. Is it okay to go a little bit over if we're okay with that? And maybe there's an online question that you could get to us. But meantime, Peter.
Thanks, Greg. Peter Leon, Herbert Smith Freehills, and ICWA trustee. My question is to Aron. Your very excellent presentation, just on the election and the Georgia Dream Party, which seems to be pro-Russian. What impact do you see that having on the Russian emigres, exiles who are in Georgia? And if you just say something very briefly about their living conditions, how they're surviving in the country, and how easy is it for them to stay there? That does seem to me to be an issue. I mean, you have this rather quixotic situation where a party which ostensibly supports joining the European Union is actually being backed by Russia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So I'll start with Russian civil society actors in Georgia. A lot of them have been already leaving over the past year and a half, because it was quite clear that the Georgian government, there have been several cases of Russian journalists or former Navalny activists who have just been denied re-entry into Georgia on totally arbitrary grounds. And nobody really knows why. There's a suspicion that the Georgian government has like a list that was given to it by Russia's federal security services of sort of names of people linked to certain organizations that shouldn't be allowed. Or,
for example, me, I was the first one who was stopped at the border,
yeah.
And I wasn't allowed to enter the country. Georgia.
Yeah, exactly. So this was a big red flag, but still there were civil society organizations there to just accommodate the large masses of Russians arriving. But now they're beginning to leave. Some could actually suffer under the new foreign agent law because they get a lot of foreign funding. As Anna Veduta mentioned, there was reform space, and now the reform space moved out of Georgia into Spain. And so for Russian civil society, it's looking quite bleak, and most have already left. The remainder, again, the tech workers, creatives, are still living in this sort of bubble. They live quite comfortable lives. They live in these little kind of isolated pods in their own Russian worlds. Because they get higher salaries than the average Georgian, and Georgia's quite a poor country, they live much more comfortably. They rent out these really nice apartments, they go to their coffee shops, and it's quite unclear what's in store for them. Will Georgia's, for example, public reaction scapegoat the Russians if the sort of liberal public of Tbilisi fails to sort of contest and combat the election results? It's very much up in the air. A lot of people who were living in Georgia who weren't, again, political exiles started moving to Serbia, because Serbia actually also has visa-free entry. It's quite easy to get a residency permit in Serbia, and the general atmosphere, though they have to do some mental gymnastics in their head, is welcoming because of the kind of pro-Russian sentiment. So, yeah.
My apologies for intervening here. If someone has a question for me, please ask it now, because I have to leave in 5 minutes tops. I'm giving opening remarks at another thing, so.
Joe, here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Joe Batad. I'm a former fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs, and I teach at MIT. I have a question for all three of you, or some of you. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know exactly what the future is going to be. But if you're sitting here 5 to 7 years from now, talking about the exile and talking about the opposition outside Russia, what will be the 2 or 3 things you will be saying differently from what you said today? How do you see the evolution of those issues we're talking about?
Evolution of what? Evolution of what?
How do you see the evolution of the issues we're talking about today in the next 4, 5, 7 years?
Well, first of all, I hope we won't have war at that time. That would be a thing to be different, hopefully. Well, it's really hard to say. We have so many black swans recently. Really, the world has changed so much since pandemic, and I'm afraid that with all the political events happening right now in most progressive Western countries, we just are not in the position to give some predictions, especially for such a huge period. Because for me, it feels like pandemic was basically like 10 years ago. It's only 4. It started like in 2020. So honestly, I don't know how to answer your question. I just hope that the war will end by then, and we will be doing everything in our power to restore Ukraine and to help, to help restore Ukraine, first of all. We will be focusing on that, if they allow us, of course.
I have just a bad answer. Like there's a phrase which stuck in my mind. Like Russia could change in one day, but it could be the same in a century. So yeah. So maybe we will live in another conditions, like in a year or in 2 years. Nobody knows, but we are trying our best, and we are trying to achieve a democracy in our country. It's very difficult to do it now. It's very difficult. Even like Biden administration, they don't know what to do with Putin. Like they don't have any clear answers on these questions. So.
Ellie, do we need to wrap up? Do we have time for a question?
We have an online question. Assuming that there is an optimistic scenario possible for Russia, what would that look like?
I think there should be a lot of urgency placed on working with the younger generation, because in the conversations we've had earlier, we've talked about how not everybody buys into this patriotism and nationalism. A lot of soldiers are joining the front lines simply to get a nice payout, not because they believe in some sort of world of Russian Ruski Mir ideology. But what's happening right now in Russia's schools is that there's militaristic propaganda. Children are forced to sing the national anthem every single morning. They are forced to partake in rifle assembly and disassembly courses, and this is quite dangerous, that there will actually, in a generation from now, will grow up into a true kind of fascistic society. So to answer the question, what's an ideal scenario is to curb that first and foremost, and to really work with young people. Try to find ways to bring them out of the country, to entice them on abroad programs. Still keep the doors open for them. And hopefully these people, will, with enough experience abroad, can come back and build something new. But it's quite difficult to envisage what is new, because the current structure of the government is so vertical, and the country is so massive and has so many resources. So, yep.
Thank you all. I think we'll wrap it up there. We have to wrap it up there. Thank you all for coming today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Let's give them a hand. Thanks to the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting us. Thanks to the U.S.-Russia Foundation for supporting Aron's fellowship. You can read Aron's dispatches on our website, www.icwa.org, and I hope you join us for future events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.